The topic of this video is the endocrine system. All right, so we're going to start with a summary of this system, which will be all of the endocrine organs throughout the body. So I'm going to start by just drawing a human overall on the side here. All right, and with this person, I'm going to draw all of the different endocrine glands that are involved in this system. One more thing I'll add in here is just a brain. So here's our summary of all the glands we're going to learn about later. And let's start with our first one, our pineal gland, which we discussed earlier in this course. It's just a little dot there in the brain. The next thing we'll discuss is the hypothalamus, which we also learned about earlier. Remember, it's that triangular looking structure. Do you remember what comes off of the hypothalamus? At the very beak of that chicken head? That is our pituitary gland. We're actually going to split that pituitary gland into anterior and posterior pituitary, but that will come in a moment. Here in this person's neck is our thyroid gland. And then our parathyroids are going to be on that. So I'll represent that with 4 dark blue dots. Next we have our thymus, which is kind of lower, right around where the lungs are. Then we have our mammary glands, which are also just known as breasts. I'm actually going to add in a little black line here to represent the diaphragm, just so we know how things are separated. One other thing I'm going to draw is our kidneys, because that's not technically part of the endocrine system, but there's something on top that is part of the endocrine system. These little light pink areas are our adrenal glands. And they sit right on top of the kidneys. Then we have a pancreas, which is about right here in that shape. more, I'm going to draw a nice little a uterus in, and then we're going to have ovaries coming out on the sides. So these little green dots are ovaries. And then similarly down below, for males, we have testes. Those are those purple little dots down there. All right, so those are all the different structures we're going to discuss in terms of the endocrine system. What all of these do is they essentially release hormones into the blood to regulate the function of the human body. And this system, as you can see, works throughout the entire body, and it's very diverse. So we're going to go through each different one of these aspects of the endocrine system in a little bit more detail now. Now, the first thing we're going to discuss is the hypothalamus. You can think of the hypothalamus almost like a chief or boss. Because it's in charge of pretty much everything for the endocrine system. Now, how is it in charge? Well, it releases one of two things, which are releasing hormones or inhibitory hormones. Now, I'm going to show you an example of how these releasing or inhibiting hormones will have an impact on the next part of the endocrine system, which is oftentimes the anterior pituitary gland, which then sends more hormones to the actual target organs, which will release hormones into the blood or into the local area. Now, an example of this that I wanted to explain to you is we'll use the thyroid gland, for example. So in this situation, your hypothalamus will send out a releasing or inhibitory hormone. And for this example, that would be thyroid releasing hormone. Now, that's next going to send it to the anterior pituitary. And what the anterior pituitary is going to be told to release by that hypothalamus's releasing or inhibitory hormone is another releasing or inhibitory hormone. So for this example with the thyroid, that would be thyroid stimulating hormone. And what that thyroid stimulating hormone does is it makes its way down to the target organ, which in this case is the thyroid. And that is going to release its own hormones into the blood. And in this example, that would be T3 or T4. So don't pay attention necessarily to the actual example hormones that I discussed, because we'll go into more detail about that later. But for this example of the thyroid, oops, let me use a better color here for the thyroid. There we go. How we get the thyroid to activate and release the hormones that we need it to. Our hypothalamus, remember, is our chief or boss. And our hypothalamus is always going to release a releasing or inhibitory hormone. In this case, the example is thyroid releasing hormone. Now, that thyroid releasing hormone activates something in the anterior pituitary. Now, what the anterior pituitary does is it provides another releasing or inhibitory hormone. In this case, for the thyroid, it's thyroid stimulating hormone. What that does is it makes its way to the target organ, in this case, which is the thyroid, to release a hormone. In this case, it would release T3 or T4. Now, I want to make sure that we understand this pathway, and the biggest takeaways from this are the fact that our hypothalamus is our chief or boss. It releases hormones that activate anterior pituitary, which releases hormones that make its way to the target organ for us to be able to release hormones from that organ. That's our standard pathway that we're looking at here. Okay, so now that we know that our hypothalamus is our chief or boss, and it usually sends things to our anterior pituitary, let's take a closer look at that next step, the anterior pituitary. And then after that, we'll look at a few of those target organs. Now let's take a look at the pituitary gland as a whole. So let's draw it. So remember, the hypothalamus is that little chicken beak, like we talked about, looking structure that's in the brain. And so let's draw the hypothalamus right there. It's that little beak. We're going to have something coming off of it, and then our pituitary gland. So let's label here, remember, is our hypothalamus. Which is our chief or boss. We're going to have something right there that's going to be coming off of the hypothalamus, giving way to the pituitary gland, and that's just going to be called our pituitary stalk. Now, our pituitary gland as a whole will be split up into two different parts, which I mentioned before. Our anterior pituitary, as well as our posterior pituitary. Now that we have this separated out, let's take a closer look specifically at posterior pituitary before we move on to anterior pituitary, which is a little bit more complicated. Now our posterior pituitary stores hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. These two hormones are antidiuretic hormone, which is also called ADH, or vasopressin. Now, you may have heard of the idea that something like tea is a diuretic because it makes you pee more. So what antidiuretic hormone does is it helps reabsorb water, which then increases blood pressure and essentially acts on the kidney. So I'm just going to make a little note here that it reabsorbs water, which then will increase blood pressure. Now the second hormone that's stored in the posterior pituitary that is made in the hypothalamus is oxytocin. Now this has a couple of different functions. Most notably, this hormone initiates uterine contractions, as well as milk let down for breastfeeding. All right, so now that we've covered posterior pituitary, that works a little bit differently. Let's review our anterior pituitary gland, because that's a little more complex, and that goes and fits in with our chain that we talked about in our first example when we were discussing hypothalamus. Alrighty. So I'm going to create a little bit of a chart for us. Remember, this is anterior pituitary. Now, on the left part of our chart, we're going to list hormones that anterior pituitary makes and secretes. And let's go through this first column now. There is an acronym that we can use, and the acronym is actually called FLAT-PIG. So we're gonna write that acronym down on our left-hand side, but we're gonna go one by one. So the first one of that acronym is follicle stimulating hormone, also known as FSH. The L for our FLAT-PIG is luteinizing hormone. Or LH. The A in FLAT-PIG is adrenocorticotropic hormone. or ACTH. The T is thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. Our P is prolactin. The I in pig can just stand for I ignore, so we're going to ignore that, and there's not an actual letter for that. Now let's do our last one, which is our growth hormone. Now remember, for all of these are hormones that the anterior pituitary makes and secretes. The first step, kind of going back to where we started off in this little example here, is the hypothalamus will release releasing or inhibitory hormones. Then it's going to make its way to anterior pituitary, which will release different hormones. Those are the hormones we're talking about right now. And those hormones are going to reach target organs that will have a different effect. So, taking our way back to this chart here, these hormones are all going to make its way to target organs. So that's going to be our next column. So the F in flat pig, follicle stimulating hormone, is going to reach gonads, which is testes and ovaries. Luteinizing hormone is actually going to do the same thing. And we're going to learn about all of that in a moment or later on in this lecture. Now, ACTH is going to go to the middle layer of adrenal cortex. And we'll discuss that later when we discuss the adrenal gland. Now, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, that's the hormone that we used in that one example that we started off with. That will make its way to the thyroid, which, as we discussed, will then release T3 and T4, and I'll explain those in a moment. Prolactin will make its way to the mammillary gland. You can remember that because lactin sounds like lactate or lactose, which signifies milk. And then our growth hormone actually has an effect on everything. So there's not one set target organ. It's just a big combination of things. Now, that's the only one that we're not going to go into too specific of detail about is the growth hormone, just because it does have an effect on everything. But just know that you could have a tumor there, which could, or, any other reason in which you may release too much growth hormone. And that's when people will have something called like gigantism or acromegaly. And that's when especially bones and everything will grow out and things will just grow more than they should. Now that we have this anterior pituitary gland down with all of these things that it makes and secretes that will make its way to different target organs, we're going to break down a few of the other glands or components to this endocrine system that will help facilitate releasing different hormones for the body to use. So let's start with our pineal gland. Now remember, if we take our little brain here, the pineal gland is right back there. And what's really important about the pineal gland is the circadian rhythm. Now, essentially, what that does is it keeps track of 24-hour cycle. So what's important is the pineal gland secretes melatonin, which is something that makes us tired. So it's really important for this gland to regulate our circadian rhythm and keep track of that 24-hour cycle, because it has to secrete melatonin at the correct time to make us tired. So that's why jet lag, it plays a pretty big role, is because we actually have a gland controlling this and hormones controlling this. So if you may have even seen people take pills for melatonin to try to regulate that cycle after they've experienced jet lag. Now the next gland we're going to talk about is the thyroid gland. So let's draw a little picture here as well. I'm going to start off just drawing the structures, and then we'll label them in a moment. So this up here is actually a bone. It is our hyoid bone. We didn't talk about this in the skeletal system because it's not one of the larger, more, some may say, more significant bones, but it is important and it plays its role in things. I'm drawing it here just so we can be aware of where our thyroid gland is in relation to other structures. Now we have something here called our thyroid cartilage. And note that your thyroid cartilage is actually the Adam's apple. Which is often more noticeable in men. Now there's another piece of cartilage down there, which is our cricoid cartilage. And then what we're really trying to talk about here is our thyroid gland. This big green structure right here. Now, our thyroid gland secretes different things. Let's review some of those. The first thing it secretes is something called calcitonin. it's exactly essentially what it sounds like. So it sounds like it's toning down the calcium, which is exactly what it does. So it decreases blood calcium levels. The second thing that the thyroid gland secretes is something that we talked about earlier, T3. I'll write out the name, but you don't worry about actually knowing the true name for it. Just know T3. Triiodothyronine. The last thing is T4. Also, don't worry about knowing the name. Thyroxine or tetraiodothyronine. Now, both of those together increase cell metabolism. So I'm going to draw an arrow here. Both of them increase cell metabolism. Now, this is important because there are several conditions associated with the thyroid gland that make sense based on the function of these two things that the thyroid gland secretes, specifically T3 and T4. So if you've ever heard of hyperthyroid, hyper means basically increase thyroid activity. That is increased T3 and T4. And when a patient has hyperthyroid, basically they will present as being like very hot all the time and very skinny, because remember that cell metabolism is increased. So they're going to be burning through things really fast. So hot, skinny, and they're going to have a higher heart rate. Now the opposite of that, low thyroid or hypothyroid, is going to be decreased T3 and T4. So for patients who have low activity of the thyroid, they're going to be more cold and have more fat on them because they don't have that increased cell metabolism. They actually have decreased cell metabolism. They're going to have low heart rate, and they're essentially just going to be more sluggish. Now, we discussed the parathyroids really briefly before. I'm going to make a quick note about them. Parathyroids. It secretes something called parathormone or parathyroid hormone, which does the opposite of what calcitonin does. So remember, calcitonin is just, the function is in the name. It tones down the calcium levels. Now, parathyroid hormone does the opposite of that. So it will increase the blood calcium levels. and it will get the calcium from bones and release it into the bloodstream to increase the blood calcium level. And the next gland that we're going to review is mammary glands, which is breasts. So there are actually two different things that we have discussed that's related to the mammary glands. One is prolactin is actually from anterior pituitary, and oxytocin is from posterior pituitary. So let's write those down. Our first one is prolactin, which basically creates production of milk, and that's driven by the anterior pituitary. Now, the second one we're going to talk about is oxytocin, which lets down the milk. Milk, which is driven by the posterior pituitary. So something to note is that the hypothalamus will actually secrete prolactin inhibitory hormone, which is dopamine. When not breastfeeding. So normally it would be produced or released actually, but your hypothalamus, remember, is that chief or boss, and it's kind of control of everything, and it will essentially inhibit prolactin through the release of dopamine when not breastfeeding. The next thing we're going to review is the thymus. What's released here is thymosin, which is important for the development of the immune system. And really, it's active in childhood, but not as an adult. All right, let's move on to our next topic, which is the pancreas. Let's draw a little picture just for reference. So your pancreas kind of looks like that. And it's surrounded by two structures that we'll make a note of. this whole thing right here is our pancreas. We're actually going to split our pancreas into a few parts. This first part right there is the head. Then we have the body. And lastly, we have the tail. Almost as if this is like a fish, which it almost does kind of look like a fish or eel straight shape structure. Now, I want to just show you kind of who's in the neighborhood right here. So this other structure off to the side here is the spleen. And spleens are usually drawn this like weird magenta-y purple color in textbooks, so I try to make it as consistent as possible. Also, pancreas is usually drawn that brownish, yellowish color. That's our spleen. And then to the side, we have our duodenum or duodenum. I've heard it pronounced both ways, and I continue to hear it pronounced both ways, so I don't think there's one that's more correct. All right, so that's what I want you to know in terms of just structures related to the pancreas. Now it secretes the following things. One is insulin, which decreases blood sugar, and it's secreted by beta islet cells. And the second thing is glucagon, which increases blood sugar, and it's secreted by alpha islet cells. Now, this pancreas is super important because it plays a huge role in a very, very common disorder known as diabetes. Now, for diabetes, there are two different types, and I wanted to review the two different types for you. So we'll split it up. Diabetes type 1. Diabetes type 1 is also known as childhood diabetes, but we don't call it that anymore. It is a autoimmune disease. So essentially with this, there are antibodies that attack beta cells. And remember, those beta cells are the ones that make insulin. So how do we treat that? we treat it with insulin injections. Insulin injections. Now there's also the more common diabetes type 2. Now in this type 2 diabetes, it's often associated with obesity and increased blood pressure. What happens is the cells actually become resistant to insulin. So the best treatment for type 2 diabetes is actually exercise and a change in diet. However, there are also drugs that can play a role in treatment. So exercise, diet change, or drugs. Oops. Now that covers the basics of the pancreas. We have a few more things to cover. The next one we're going to cover is our adrenal gland. Now let's do a cross section of the adrenal gland. We're gonna color each different layer, and then I'll describe what those different layers are in a moment. But essentially, we're gonna separate this adrenal gland into two different parts. So I'm going to draw the first part. I'm actually gonna try to use different like pinkish colors for the outside, because the outside as a whole is called the adrenal cortex. So let's see if we can do this, but still make them unique. There we go. Here's another layer of the adrenal cortex. And our last layer of the adrenal cortex. So I'll say pink adrenal cortex, and this little green dot in the center. Green is adrenal medulla. All right, now let's separate it. So this outer layer, this lightest pink right here, is going to essentially be in control of salt. So with that, there are mineral corticoids that it releases, and the primary one is something called aldosterone. And essentially it regulates salt and water in the body. So that's that light pink outer layer. Now the next layer, which is in that like darker magenta shade, is going to be in charge of sugar. So with that, it will release glucocorticoids, primary being, our stress hormone, which is cortisol. So now we move to this bright pink layer, which is this third deepest layer of the adrenal cortex. That stands for sex. And it does so because it releases testosterone, which has multiple sexual functions for both men and women. Now that last center aspect is going to be our fourth S of the adrenal gland, which is going to be speed. And we talk about this salt, sugar, sex, speed, those 4 different S's. Our last one is speed because it releases epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline. And this will increase something called cardiac output, which is basically the blood that is being pumped out by the heart. And it will raise blood glucose as well. And essentially the reason for that is that it speeds things up so the body can function a little bit easier during times of stress. Remember we discussed FSH and LH? I want to discuss that a little bit further and how it's related to gonads. So lastly, we have our gonads, or ovaries, and testes. Now, those 2 hormones that have a role on the gonads are follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, which in men, it helps control sperm production as it's released to have an action with the ovaries, or with the testes, excuse me. And then for women, it controls menstrual cycle, and it stimulates growth of eggs. Now, I just want you to know that the follicle stimulating hormone has a role with both men and women. You don't need to really go into detail here, but I wanted to inform you of the functions of these. Now, the next one is luteinizing hormone, which is LH, and that also has a role for both men and women. And with men, it has an effect on the testes, and women on the ovaries. Just again, know that these 2 have an effect on both men and women. But one more thing, I wanted to discuss here is to give you the basics of something called the ovarian cycle, which is for anyone with ovaries, as the name sounds. So I want to draw this out in a little bit of a graph. Now this is actually a super complicated cycle, and we're just going to brush over the very, very basics of it. And it's beyond the scope of our course to go further into it, so we're just going to leave it at this for now. This is going to be days down below on our x-axis. We're going to have 1, 5, 14, and 28 days, which is essentially the number of days for a cycle. Now, let's draw a few lines. The first one is going to be luteinizing hormone, and I'm just going to show you what happens with luteinizing hormone. So essentially, luteinizing hormone is just going to be going along, and there's going to be a big spike right here at day 14. Now, the other one I'm going to underline for FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. There's going to be a little bit of a bump and then a little bit of a peak here, and then it'll level out. Now this is important because this spike in LH right here causes ovulation. And essentially, ovulation is when the egg is ejected, and it's going to make its way down to eventually become fertilized if pregnancy is intended, or if not, it'll just be released. Now this covers just the basics of this ovarian cycle, and one more thing to add in is in here, this is when menstruation occurs, and then day 14 is, or somewhere around day 14 is when ovulation occurs. And that's the basics. Don't worry about knowing much more. Just know that there is an ovarian cycle, and this is kind of how the hormones play a role in dictating that ovarian cycle and playing a role with menstruation and with ovulation or release of that egg to allow females or people with uteruses and ovaries to become pregnant. Now, that's our broad overview of our endocrine system. Just to wrap things up, we went over all of these different aspects of the endocrine system that are throughout the entire body. We covered the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, which is really our chief, our pituitary gland, thyroid and parathyroid, thymus, mammary glands, adrenal glands, pancreas, and then ovaries and testes briefly at the end.